At 4:18 on a Thursday afternoon, I came home from visiting an old friend and discovered that my key no longer opened my front door. The heavy brass key slid in halfway. Then it stopped. It was not jammed. It was not rusted. It had been changed. I stepped back and looked through the large front window into my living room. A woman I did not know was sitting in my late wife's favorite armchair. She was drinking tea from Eleanor's delicate, hand-painted porcelain cup. Her shoes were resting on Eleanor's antique Persian rug, and beside her oversized suitcase, stacked neatly against the wall by the staircase, were 3 large cardboard boxes. Each one was labeled in thick, aggressive black marker. Asterisk Linda, Mother's Room. I walked back to the door. I didn't pound on it. I knocked once firmly. 10 seconds later, the deadbolt clicked. My son, David, opened the door, but only as far as the heavy brass security chain allowed. He peered out at me through the 3-inch gap. "Dad," David said, refusing to meet my eyes. "You're back early." Behind him, my daughter-in-law, Chloe, appeared in the hallway. She folded her arms across her chest like she owned the space. From the living room, Chloe's mother, Linda, smiled at me over the rim of Eleanor's teacup. "Such a lovely chair," Linda called out, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your wife had good taste." "Why doesn't my key work, David?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. David swallowed hard. Then he said the sentence that permanently ended whatever patience I had left for my only son. "We decided this house needs a real family in it," David said, his tone shifting into the patronizing cadence of an adult speaking to a difficult child. I did not shout. I did not break the glass in the front window. I simply set the bag of fresh peaches down on the porch mat, pulled my phone from my coat pocket, took one clear photograph of the new silver lock cylinder against the dark oak door. Then I asked my son a single question. "David, whose name do you think is on the deed?" Chloe laughed softly from behind him. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was a laugh of pure, undisguised entitlement. "Arthur, please," Chloe said, stepping closer so she could speak clearly through the gap. "David is your only heir. We're just speeding up the inevitable. You'll be much more comfortable in a place designed for someone your age." That was the moment I understood. They had not changed the lock because they were afraid I would come home. They had changed it because they thought I would eventually stop trying. But Chloe had made one mistake. She changed the lock. She did not change the deed. A key lets you enter a house. It does not make the house yours. But if you give someone a key when they have nothing else, they will eventually convince themselves they own the door. I was 69 years old. Before I retired, I had spent 40 years working in real estate development. I had been a contractor, a building inspector, and eventually a small-town developer. I understood property. I understood deeds, permits, property lines, and zoning laws. I knew how houses were built from the foundation up, and I knew how they fell apart. But none of that professional knowledge had prepared me for how quickly a home could fall apart from the inside. The house on Cedar Lane wasn't a mansion, but it was massive in its significance. Eleanor and I had bought it the year we were married. I had replaced the roof with my own hands. Eleanor had planted the hydrangeas that lined the driveway. Every scratch on the hardwood floor, every faded patch of wallpaper in the hallway was a ledger of our life together. When Eleanor passed away 4 years ago, the house suddenly felt entirely too large. The silence was heavy, oppressive. I found myself traveling more, taking long road trips to visit old friends just to avoid sitting in an empty living room. I was lonely, and that loneliness made me incredibly vulnerable when my son came asking for help. 14 months ago, David's life had completely collapsed. David was 41. He had always been ambitious, but his ambition was rarely matched by his work ethic. He had started a boutique logistics company, heavily leveraged against his personal assets. When the market shifted, his company didn't just fail, it detonated. He lost the business, he lost his savings, and eventually, He and Chloe received an eviction notice for their high-end apartment downtown. David had driven out to the house on Cedar Lane, sat at my kitchen table and cried. "Dad, I have nowhere else to go," he had said, burying his face in his hands. "We're completely broke. We just need a place to stay while we get back on our feet." Just a few months, I looked at my son. I saw the desperation in his eyes, and I felt the heavy, echoing emptiness of my massive house. I didn't see a threat. I saw my boy. "Of course you can stay here, David," I told him. "This is your family home." That was my first mistake. I mistook their comfort for gratitude. I cleared out the large guest bedroom on the second floor. It was a beautiful room with a view of the backyard, entirely separate from the master suite that Eleanor and I had shared. When they moved in, I set very few ground rules. I just asked them to respect the house. I specifically asked them not to move Eleanor's things. Her books were still on the shelves. Her china was still in the cabinet. Her favorite reading chair was exactly where she had left it. "We just need a little time, Arthur," Chloe had said the day they arrived, hugging me tightly. "We are so incredibly grateful. We'll be out of your hair before you know it." For the first 3 months, they were perfect guests. They cleaned up after themselves, they cooked dinner twice a week, and they were quiet. The house felt alive again. I thought I had made a wonderful decision, but entitlement doesn't usually announce itself with a battering ram. It creeps in through the cracks of your generosity. It started small. I came home one afternoon to find that the heavy, dark velvet curtains in the living room, the ones Eleanor had spent months searching antique stores to find, had been taken down and replaced with cheap, sheer white panels. "Oh, Arthur," Chloe said cheerfully when I asked about it. "The room was just so dark, it felt incredibly dated. This opens up the space so much better. I boxed the old ones up for you in the basement." I bit my tongue. I told myself it was just curtains. A month later, Eleanor's extensive collection of vintage gardening books disappeared from the hallway shelves, replaced by Chloe's decorative geometric vases and framed inspirational quotes. "It was just clutter, Dad," David said when I confronted him, refusing to look me in the eye. "Chloe's just trying to make the place feel a little more modern." They weren't just decorating, they were erasing her. By the 8th month, the subtle shifts in territory escalated into open verbal framing. Chloe stopped referring to it as your house. She started calling it our family base. When I mentioned that I was thinking about repainting the trim on the porch, Chloe had interrupted me. "Actually, Arthur, David and I were talking," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "We think it might be better to just reside the whole front exterior next spring. It's an investment in the property value." I looked at her, stunned. "It's my property value, Chloe," I said firmly. Chloe had just smiled, a thin, condescending line. "Well, sure, but we're all living here now, and it's important to think about the long term." David had sat at the table, eating his dinner, completely silent. He let his wife lay claim to my history while he chewed his steak. I should have kicked them out that night. I should have packed their bags and put them on the porch. But they were family, and David was still struggling to find steady work. I convinced myself that their overreach was just a misguided attempt to feel secure after losing their apartment. I didn't realize they weren't trying to feel secure. They were trying to take over. The final escalation began 3 weeks before I found myself locked out. Chloe had cornered me in the kitchen while I was making my morning coffee. "Arthur, we really need to talk about this space," she said, gesturing vaguely to the large house around us. "You have 3 empty bedrooms. You have a formal dining room you never use. It's ridiculous for a man your age to be managing all this square footage." "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own home, Chloe," I replied, keeping my voice level. "But you shouldn't have to," she insisted, her voice dripping with that toxic, suffocating fake concern. "Have you seen the new senior living community over by the lake? The Grove? They have beautiful, manageable apartments. No stairs, maid service. You'd be around people your own age. I'm not moving into a senior apartment, I said flatly. Chloe's smile had tightened. We'll see. It just makes the most logical sense for the family. I had left for my road trip a week later, needing space from the suffocating tension in my own home. I thought my absence would cool things down. I thought it would give them a chance to reflect on how disrespectful they were being. I had no idea that the moment my truck pulled out of the driveway, Chloe had picked up her phone. She didn't call a realtor. She called a locksmith, and then she called her mother. I didn't turn around and march back to my truck immediately. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, letting the cold air clear the initial shock from my system. I looked at the silver cylinder of the new lock. I looked at the bag of fresh peaches sitting on the welcome mat. And then I turned and walked down the steps. I didn't drive away. I walked across the front lawn, my boots crunching on the dry grass, and crossed the property line to the house next door. Nora Alvarez was waiting on her front porch. She was 72, a retired high school English teacher who had lived next to Eleanor and me for 30 years. She was wearing a heavy cardigan, holding a mug of coffee, and her expression was a mixture of deep sorrow and simmering rage. She had watched the entire interaction on my porch. "Come inside, Arthur," Nora said softly, holding her screen door open. I walked into her kitchen. It smelled like cinnamon and old paper. It was a comforting, familiar smell, one that sharply contrasted with the sudden violent alienation I had just experienced on my own doorstep. I sat down at Nora's small kitchen table. She poured me a cup of black coffee and set it down in front of me. "When did she do it, Nora?" I asked. "Tuesday morning," Nora replied, sitting across from me. "You left on Sunday. By Tuesday at 9 o'clock. A commercial locksmith van was parked in your driveway." Nora had been standing at her kitchen window, washing dishes, when the van pulled up. She watched a man in a blue uniform walk up to my front door carrying a heavy toolbox. Chloe had met him on the porch. Nora couldn't hear the entire conversation, but she heard enough. She told the locksmith that her father-in-law was transitioning into assisted living soon, Nora said, her voice tight with disgust. She said you were starting to have memory issues, and she needed to update the exterior locks for safety and insurance purposes. I closed my eyes. The sheer, calculated cruelty of the lie was breathtaking. Chloe wasn't just changing a piece of hardware. She was actively laying the groundwork for a narrative where I was an incompetent, failing old man who needed his children to manage his life. "And David?" I asked. "Was he there?" "He was standing right behind her," Nora confirmed grimly. "When the locksmith finished, the man handed the clipboard to your son. David signed the receipt. He paid for it." I gripped the warm coffee mug, feeling a sickening knot tighten in my stomach. The betrayal wasn't just Chloe's ambition. It was David's complicity. He had stood on the porch of the house I built, the house where his mother had raised him, and signed his name to lock me out of it. "And the mother?" I asked. "Linda arrived yesterday afternoon," Nora said. "Chloe drove her over in David's SUV. They started unloading boxes before the engine was even turned off. Nora had walked out to her fence line, unable to contain herself, and asked Chloe exactly what was going on. Chloe had smiled that same thin, condescending smile. "Oh, Nora," she had said over the fence. "We're just rearranging a bit. With Arthur moving out, the house is just too big for David and me. My mother recently lost her condo, so it just makes perfect financial sense to bring her in. We're building a multi-generational family home." "And David let her move Linda's things into Eleanor's spaces?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nora looked down at her hands. "Arthur, she was directing David on where to put the boxes," Nora said quietly. I heard Linda complaining about the floral wallpaper in the hallway. She asked Chloe if they could tear up the antique Persian rug because it smelled like old people. "She didn't just want a room, Arthur. She wants the master suite." The image of Linda sitting in Eleanor's chair, drinking from Eleanor's teacup, flashed back into my mind with violent clarity. then it is time somebody living sat in it. That was what Linda had reportedly said to David when he weakly suggested that the chair belonged to his mother. Nora had heard it through the open windows. Miriam would have opened that door herself and dragged them out by their manners, Nora said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce loyalty to my late wife. You can't let them do this, Arthur. Call the police. Have them removed for trespassing. I took a slow sip of the black coffee. I couldn't call the police. Not yet. Legally, David and Chloe were not trespassers. I had voluntarily invited them to live in the house 14 months ago. By state law, they had established residency. If I called the sheriff to report a lockout, it would become a civil dispute. The police would tell me to take it to housing court, a process that could take months, during which time Chloe and Linda would continue to erase every trace of Eleanor from the house. Worse, if I caused a massive, screaming scene on the front lawn, it would perfectly support the narrative Chloe was already spinning to the locksmith and the neighbors, that I was an erratic, unstable old man suffering from cognitive decline. If I broke a window to get into my own home, Chloe would film it. She would use my anger as proof that I was a danger to myself and needed to be institutionalized. I couldn't fight them with a hammer. I had to fight them with paper. I finished my coffee and stood up from the table. Thank you, Nora, I said, for watching the house. Where are you going to go? She asked, looking worried. You can stay in my guest room, Arthur. You don't have to go to a motel. I appreciate that, Nora. Truly. But I'm going to head into town. There's something I need to retrieve from my safety deposit box. I walked back out to my truck. I didn't look at my house as I backed out of the driveway. I didn't need to. I knew exactly who was inside it, and I knew exactly what they were trying to do. I drove to a small, quiet motel on the edge of town, checked into a single room, and then drove to the local bank branch. I walked into the vault and opened my safety deposit box. Inside, resting beneath a stack of old tax returns and our marriage certificate, was a thick, dark green folder. It was the deed folder. When Eleanor was first diagnosed with cancer, we sat down and had a series of very long, very painful conversations about the future. Eleanor was a brilliant woman, far more pragmatic than I was. She knew that I was a fixer. I liked to fix houses, and I liked to fix people. She also knew that David, despite being our son, had a profound weakness of character. Arthur, she had told me one night, sitting up in bed with a yellow legal pad in her lap, when I am gone, you are going to be lonely. And when David fails, because he will fail again, he is going to come to you for help. And because you are a good father, you will give him everything you have until you have nothing left. I had tried to argue with her, but she had simply held up a hand. I am not going to let you sacrifice your peace for his comfort, Eleanor had said firmly. I am going to protect you from your own generosity. She had contacted Evelyn Price, the sharpest estate attorney in the county, and together they had drafted a legal fortress. I sat on the edge of the cheap motel bed, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and opened the dark green folder. Inside was the original deed to the house on Cedar Lane. But the deed was no longer in my name, nor was it in Eleanor's. 10 years ago, Eleanor had quietly transferred the ownership of the property into the *Eleanor Whitaker Revocable Trust. I flipped to the third page of the trust agreement. The terms were absolute, ironclad, and devastatingly clear. Arthur Whitaker retains lifetime occupancy and exclusive administrative control of the property. He cannot be evicted, coerced, or displaced under any circumstances. David Whitaker is named as a future, conditional beneficiary. However, his future interest is strictly contingent upon his behavior. I ran my finger over the specific clause Eleanor and Evelyn had drafted specifically for a scenario just like this. Any attempt by a future beneficiary to establish unauthorized permanent residency, displace the primary occupant, or alter the locks and access to the property without written consent from Arthur Whitaker will be considered a hostile act of interference. Such actions will immediately trigger a revocation of all future beneficiary rights. Eleanor hadn't just protected my home. She had rigged the house to financially detonate if David ever tried to steal it. Tucked into the back of the folder was a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. I opened it. It was a short letter, written on her personal stationery. Arthur, T., if you are reading this, it means David has forgotten the difference between a son and an owner. I know it hurts you to see him this way, but remember, generosity gave them rooms. It did not give them authority. If David ever forgets that inheritance is not permission, show him the page he never bothered to read. Love. Eleanor. I stared at the letter until my vision blurred. I took a deep breath, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. I didn't need to break down my front door. I didn't need to yell at Chloe. I just needed to make a phone call. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the number for Evelyn Price. Evelyn, I said when the attorney answered. Arthur, it's been a while. Is everything all right? No, Evelyn, I replied, my voice steady, anchored by the weight of the green folder in my lap. David changed the locks on the house. He moved his mother-in-law into Eleanor's chair. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of Evelyn closing a file folder in her office. Changing a lock does not change ownership, Arthur, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute, terrifying legal precision. It just creates evidence. Are you safe right now? I'm at the motel out on Highway 9. Good. Stay there tonight. Tomorrow we are going to arrange a meeting. And we are going to remind your son exactly whose house he is sitting in. I didn't sleep that night in the motel room. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the ice machine in the hallway, letting 30 years of memories play out against the cheap floral wallpaper. I thought about David learning to ride a bike in the driveway. I thought about Eleanor painting the front door red because she read somewhere that it brought good luck. I thought about the first time David brought Chloe home, how desperate she had seemed to impress us, how quickly she had identified the cracks in our son's confidence and slipped herself into them. The grief of losing my wife was a dull, constant ache. But the grief of losing a living son, watching him mutate into a willing accomplice in my own erasure, was a sharp, suffocating agony. By the time the sun came up, the sadness had burned away completely. What was left was a cold, impenetrable resolve. I met Evelyn Price at her office at 8 o'clock the next morning. Evelyn was 71, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and had the kind of ruthless legal mind that made her the most feared estate attorney in the county. She had been a close friend of Eleanor's, and she didn't just view the Eleanor Whitaker revocable trust as a document. She viewed it as a promise she had made to a dying woman. She poured me a cup of coffee and sat across from me at her heavy mahogany desk. I need a timeline, Arthur, Evelyn said, clicking her pen. Detail every interaction from the moment you arrived on the porch. I told her everything, the changed lock, Linda sitting in Eleanor's chair, the boxes labeled Mother's Room, Chloe's smug, entitled Laughter, David's absolute failure to defend his own father. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her knuckles turned white as she gripped her pen. They are operating under the assumption that a future beneficiary holds present authority, Evelyn said, her voice clipped and precise. It's a common, incredibly arrogant mistake. They believe that because the property will eventually pass to David, he has the right to manage it now, particularly if they can establish that you are struggling to live independently. She changed the lock so I couldn't get back in, I said. No, Evelyn corrected me, tapping her pen on the desk. She changed the lock to force a confrontation. She wants you to break a window. She wants you to call the police and scream at her mother. She wants a documented public incident so she can file for emergency conservatorship or force a buyout. If you had lost your temper yesterday, Arthur, you would have handed her the keys to your own prison. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I hadn't realized just how close I had come to stepping into a trap. "So, what do we do?" I asked. "We don't get angry," Evelyn said, leaning forward. "We get surgical." Eleanor anticipated this exact scenario. She built a kill switch into the trust. Evelyn pulled a copy of the trust agreement from her file and laid it on the desk. "David is a conditional beneficiary," she explained, pointing to Section 7. "His inheritance is contingent upon his adherence to the occupancy rules. The moment he authorized a lock change to restrict your access, he violated the core covenant of the trust. Furthermore, by moving an unauthorized tenant, his mother-in-law, into the property, he has created an adversarial occupation. Can we evict them?" "We can do much more than that," Evelyn said, a fierce, protective spark in her eyes. "But we need to let them commit to their narrative first. We need them to state, on the record, exactly what they are trying to do." My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from David. "Dad, we need to talk like adults. Come to the house tomorrow at 10 a.m. We have some people here who can help us sort this out." I showed the message to Evelyn. She smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "They're holding an intervention," Evelyn said. "They've probably invited a realtor, or a senior housing consultant, or maybe even a mediator to pressure you into signing a transition agreement. They want to corner you in your own living room." I looked at the text message. The arrogance of my son summoning me to my own house to negotiate my surrender was almost too much to process. "I'll tell him I'm coming," I said. "Don't just tell him you're coming, Arthur," Evelyn said, standing up from her desk. "Tell him you're ready to listen. Let them set the stage. Let them feel completely in control. Because tomorrow morning, I am walking through that door with you, and we are going to bring Carl Benson." Carl Benson was the managing officer at the local bank that held the trust account. He was the independent fiduciary legally obligated to execute the terms of Eleanor's trust. If Evelyn was the architect of my defense, Carl was the executioner. The next morning, I parked my truck down the street from my house. I didn't want Chloe to see my vehicle in the driveway and start preparing her defenses. Evelyn and Carl arrived in a separate car. Carl was a tall, serious man in a dark suit who looked like he had never laughed a day in his life. He carried a heavy leather briefcase. "Are you ready, Arthur?" Evelyn asked as we stood on the sidewalk. I looked at the house. I looked at the hydrangeas Eleanor had planted, now dormant for the winter. "I'm ready to take my house back," I said. I walked up the front steps. I didn't have a key, so I had to ring my own doorbell. The sheer humiliation of that act, standing on my own porch, asking for permission to enter, burned in my chest, but I pushed it down. David opened the door. He was wearing a nice button-down shirt, looking like a man trying very hard to project authority. His eyes flicked to Evelyn and Carl, and a brief flash of confusion crossed his face. "Dad," David said, stepping aside, "I see you brought guests." "These are my advisors," I said simply, stepping past him into the foyer. The living room had been entirely rearranged. Eleanor's reading chair had been pushed into a corner to make room for a massive, modern sectional sofa that I didn't recognize. The antique rug was gone, replaced by a cheap, sterile gray carpet. The erasure was accelerating. Sitting on the new sectional was Chloe, looking immaculate and deeply sympathetic. Beside her sat Linda, who was holding a notepad and a pen, looking as if she were preparing to take minutes at a corporate board meeting. Sitting across from them were two strangers. One was a woman in a sharp blazer holding a stack of glossy brochures. The other was a man in a polo shirt holding an iPad. "Arthur," Chloe said, standing up and offering a warm, tragic smile. "Thank you for coming. We know the other day was emotional. We wanted to create a safe space to have a real conversation about the future." "Who are these people, Chloe?" I asked, gesturing to the strangers. Chloe gestured gracefully to the woman. "This is Brenda. She's a placement specialist for the Grove Senior Living community. And this is Tom. He's a real estate consultant. We brought them here to show you that you have options, Arthur. Beautiful. comfortable options. David walked into the living room and stood behind his wife, putting a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Dad," David said softly, "we're doing this because we love you. You can't keep living here alone. The stairs are too much for you. The maintenance is too much. We've decided to step up and take the burden off your shoulders." I looked at the senior living consultant, who offered me a professionally trained smile. "Mr. Whitaker," Brenda said, leaning forward, "we have a wonderful first-floor unit available starting next week. It has grab bars in the bathroom, weekly housekeeping, and a wonderful community dining room. Chloe and David have already placed a deposit to hold it for you." I looked back at Chloe. She had already put money down to lock me into a nursing apartment. The sheer, suffocating audacity of the trap she had built was staggering. "And the house?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "What happens to the house?" Chloe sighed, a masterclass in feigned burden. "Well, obviously, David and I will take over the mortgage and the upkeep. We'll make it our primary residence. My mother will stay with us to help with the property. It's keeping the home in the family, Arthur. It's exactly what Eleanor would have wanted." "Do not say her name," I said. The room went completely silent. My voice hadn't been loud, but it had cut through the air like a straight razor. Chloe blinked, taken aback, but quickly recovered her patronizing composure. "Arthur, there's no need to be hostile. We're just trying to find a solution that works for everyone. This is not about taking your home. It is about giving this house the family it deserves." I looked at my son. He was staring at the floor again. "Good," I said, nodding slowly. "Then let's talk about what the house deserves." I turned to Evelyn Price. Evelyn unclasped her briefcase and pulled out the dark green deed folder. She placed it squarely on the coffee table, right in front of Chloe. Then Carl Benson stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from his own bag. "David," Evelyn said, her voice ringing out with terrifying absolute authority, "you invited your father here today under the assumption that you hold a controlling interest in this property. You do not." Chloe scoffed, crossing her legs. "Evelyn, with all due respect, David is the sole heir to this estate. As his wife, I am perfectly within my rights to help him manage his future assets." Carl Benson didn't smile. He looked at Chloe with the cold, dead eyes of a bank auditor finding a massive fraud. "Mrs. Whitaker," Carl said, his voice echoing in the quiet living room, "future interest is not present ownership. And as of this morning, your husband's future interest no longer exists." The smug, entitled mask on Chloe's face finally cracked. "What?" David asked, stepping out from behind his wife. "What do you mean?" Carl opened his folder. "This property is wholly owned by the Eleanor Whitaker Revocable Trust," Carl announced. "And according to the terms established by your late mother, your inheritance was strictly conditional upon your behavior." Evelyn picked up the thread, turning her gaze on David. "By changing the locks on Thursday to restrict your father's access, and by moving an unauthorized tenant into the property without his written consent, you have triggered a hostile interference clause," Evelyn explained. I watched the color drain completely from my son's face. "You thought you were locking a vulnerable old man out of his house," I told David, my voice finally breaking through the calm, vibrating with the rage I had suppressed for 48 hours. "You were actually locking yourself out of your inheritance." Chloe stood up, her face flushing bright red with panic. "You can't do that. He's the only son. He's going to inherit it anyway." I looked her dead in the eye. "Not if he tries to inherit it while I'm still breathing." The silence in the living room was absolute. Brenda, the senior living consultant, slowly lowered her glossy brochures to her lap. Tom, the real estate agent, quietly closed the cover of his iPad. Both of them were professionals, and both of them suddenly realized they had been drafted as unwitting accomplices in an attempted coup against a man who held all the legal cards. "Excuse me," Brenda said, her professional warmth replaced by a sharp, highly offended chill. "Mrs. Whitaker," Did you inform the Grove that your father-in-law was the legal administrator of an active trust? Chloe stuttered, looking desperately at David. It's a formality. The house is staying in the family. We just needed to get the transition started. You told me he was experiencing severe cognitive decline and that you held medical power of attorney, Brenda said, standing up and smoothing her blazer. You asked me to bring the deposit paperwork today because you said he was finally ready to accept help. I watched Chloe shrink under the consultant's glare. The entire carefully constructed narrative of the loving, burdened children was evaporating before my eyes. I am canceling your deposit, Brenda told Chloe firmly. We do not participate in forced relocations, and we certainly do not do business with people who falsify power of attorney. Have a good day, Mr. Whitaker. I am terribly sorry to have intruded on your home. Me too, Tom added, standing up quickly and following Brenda toward the front door. Lose my number, David. When the front door clicked shut behind the two professionals, the atmosphere in the room shifted from awkward tension to pure, unadulterated dread. It was just family now. Family and the two financial executioners I had brought with me. David finally found his voice. Dad, listen, David pleaded, holding his hands up defensively. We didn't want to do it this way, but you're so stubborn you wouldn't listen to reason. We just wanted to make sure the house was taken care of before I died, I asked softly. David winced. I didn't say that. You didn't have to, I told my son. You acted on it. You looked at this house. You looked at your life and you decided that your future inheritance was more important than my present life. I turned to Chloe. You thought I was just a tired old man who didn't know how to fight back, I said. You thought if you moved your mother in, I would just retreat to a nursing home to avoid the conflict. Chloe crossed her arms, her jaw set in a tight, defiant line. You're being dramatic, Arthur. We're just trying to be practical. My mother needs a place to stay. You have 3 empty bedrooms. It's incredibly selfish of you to hoard this much space when your own family is struggling. I didn't answer her. I looked at Evelyn. Evelyn opened her briefcase again and pulled out a stack of formal, watermarked documents. She didn't hand them to Chloe. She handed them directly to David. Mr. Whitaker, Evelyn said, her voice echoing the absolute authority of the trust. As the fiduciary representative of the Eleanor Whitaker Revocable Trust, it is my duty to inform you that your conditional residency in this property has been terminated. David stared at the papers in his hand. What is this? It is a formal 30-day notice to vacate, Evelyn stated clearly. You and your wife were invited as temporary guests. By attempting to restrict the primary administrator's access to the property, you have forfeited your guest status. Chloe scoffed loudly. 30 days? You can't evict us in 30 days. We have tenant rights. Carl Benson, the trust officer, leaned forward. Actually, Mrs. Whitaker, you do not have traditional tenant rights. Carl corrected her, his tone perfectly flat. You do not have a lease. You do not pay rent. You are legally classified as at-will licensees. Under the specific terms of this trust, a breach of the non-interference clause allows the administrator to terminate that license immediately. The 30 days is a courtesy Mr. Whitaker is extending to his son. Linda, who had been sitting quietly on the new sofa, finally decided to insert herself into the battle. This is outrageous, Linda snapped, glaring at me. You're throwing your own son out on the street? Because of a door lock? Where are we supposed to go? I turned my full attention to Linda for the first time since I had walked in. I am not throwing you out on the street, Linda, I said calmly. I am throwing you out of my wife's house. Linda bristled. I was invited here. By a guest, I reminded her. A guest cannot grant residency to another guest. You have no legal standing in this home. You have 24 hours to pack those boxes and remove yourself from this property. If you are not gone by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will have the sheriff remove you for trespassing. You wouldn't dare, Chloe hissed, her face contorting with rage. He's your son, Arthur. If you do this, you'll never see us again. I looked at David. I looked at the boy I had taught to ride a bike. The man I had taken in when he had lost everything. He was hiding behind his wife, letting her use his bloodline as a weapon to steal my home. If this is what seeing you looks like, David, I said, my voice thick with a grief I couldn't entirely hide, I think I'll survive the absence. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. The sharp chime echoed through the tense silence of the living room. Chloe frowned. Are we expecting someone else? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. I am, I replied. I walked into the foyer and opened the front door. Standing on the porch was a man in a blue uniform, holding a heavy metal toolbox. He was the same locksmith who had parked his commercial van in my driveway on Tuesday morning. I had found his company's name on the invoice Nora had photographed on the kitchen counter through the window. When I called him an hour ago, I had requested emergency service at my address. Mr. Whitaker? The locksmith asked, looking slightly confused to see me opening the door. I got a call about a lock change. Yes, please come in, I said, stepping aside. The locksmith walked into the foyer, his heavy boots thudding on the hardwood. He stopped when he saw the crowd in the living room. His eyes landed on Chloe, and a look of recognition flashed across his face. Oh, hi, the locksmith said, nodding to Chloe. Everything okay with the new cylinder I installed on Tuesday? Chloe's eyes widened in sudden, absolute panic. She realized exactly what was happening. Arthur, what is this? Chloe demanded, her voice shrill. I ignored her. I turned to the locksmith. Sir, I asked politely, when you changed the lock on this door on Tuesday, who authorized the work? The locksmith looked uncomfortable, glancing between me and Chloe. Well, she did, he said, pointing to Chloe. She said her father-in-law was moving out for health reasons, and the family needed the locks updated for security. The husband signed the invoice. I turned to Evelyn. Evelyn pulled the original deed and the trust summary from her folder and held them out to the locksmith. Sir, I am the attorney for the Eleanor Whitaker Revocable Trust, Evelyn said clearly. My client, Mr. Arthur Whitaker, is the sole legal administrator of this property. He did not authorize a lock change, nor did he consent to being restricted from his own home. The locksmith's face drained of color. He looked at the legal documents, then looked at Chloe with an expression of dawning horror. Lady, you told me you owned the house, the locksmith said to Chloe, his voice rising in anger. You told me the owner had dementia. Do you know what kind of liability you just put my company under? Tampering with a lock on a trust property without the administrator's consent is a crime. I didn't know. Chloe lied, backing up a step. We're on the deed. You are on nothing, Carl Benson said from the corner, his voice like a gavel striking wood. The locksmith turned back to me, looking genuinely panicked. Mr. Whitaker, I am so sorry. If I had known there was a dispute, I never would have drilled that cylinder. I can put the old one back on. I still have it in the truck, no charge. I looked at the locksmith, then I looked at Chloe. She was standing in the center of the living room she had tried to conquer, surrounded by the modern furniture she had bought to erase my wife's memory. She was exposed, humiliated, and completely powerless. That won't be necessary, I told the locksmith. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key, the original key that had opened the door of this house for 36 years. Just take her lock off my door, I said. The locksmith didn't hesitate. He dropped his toolbox in the foyer, grabbed his drill, and walked straight to the front door. The high-pitched whine of the drill filled the house. It was the sound of a hostile occupation being dismantled. Chloe covered her face with her hands, letting out a sharp, frustrated sob. Linda sat frozen on the new sectional, her eyes darting toward the cardboard boxes stacked against the wall, realizing she was about to be homeless again. And David just stood there. He watched the locksmith remove the silver cylinder Chloe had paid for, and he watched the heavy wooden door swing open, perfectly free. A key lets you enter a house. It does not make the house yours. The dismantling of Chloe's grand illusion happened with brutal, mechanical efficiency. Linda did not wait for the sheriff. By 8 o'clock the next morning, she was gone. Nora watched from her porch as Linda dragged the boxes labeled Mother's Room back across the lawn to load into Chloe's car. The same thick black marker that had aggressively announced her arrival now looked like a public confession of her entitlement. She didn't leave a thank you note. I hadn't expected one. Chloe and David took exactly 28 days to vacate the property. The atmosphere in the house during those 4 weeks was venomous, but entirely silent. Chloe stopped speaking to me altogether. She packed her modern geometric vases, her framed inspirational quotes, and her aggressive entitlement into cardboard boxes, slamming doors whenever I was in the vicinity. I didn't care. I let her slam all the doors she wanted, because I knew that in a few short weeks, she would never be able to open them again. By Monday morning, Evelyn had collected written statements from Brenda, Tom, Nora, and the locksmith. The Grove refunded the deposit and marked Chloe's file as an attempted coercive placement. The realtor sent a formal email confirming that he had been misled about the ownership structure. And the locksmith's company issued an official incident report, stating that Chloe had falsely claimed authority over a trust property. The consequences for Chloe were permanent. But David's legal reality was much bleaker than just losing a free place to stay. Carl Benson initiated a formal review of the Eleanor Whitaker Revocable Trust. Because David had actively participated in a hostile action against the primary administrator, he was stripped of his status as a future trustee. He was placed on a strict probationary beneficiary warning. The trust did not forgive David. It suspended him over a cliff. If he attempted to challenge my residency or manipulate my medical status again, the trust would automatically bypass him entirely, donating the value of the estate to a local land conservation charity upon my death. He had tried to steal a house to secure his future, and in doing so, he had effectively burned his future to the ground. On the day they finally moved out, the house felt heavy. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was exhausted. It was the silence of a battlefield after the artillery had finally stopped firing. Nora came over that afternoon. She didn't bring casserole or offer empty platitudes. She brought a box cutter, a bottle of heavy-duty glass cleaner, and a profound understanding of what needed to be done. Together, we began the process of reclaiming the space. We tore down the cheap, sheer white panels Chloe had hung in the living room and brought Eleanor's heavy, dark velvet curtains up from the basement. I hung them myself, the familiar weight of the fabric feeling like a protective shroud returning to the windows. We unpacked the boxes Chloe had shoved into the back of the garage. We put Eleanor's vintage gardening books back on the hallway shelves, exactly where they belonged. I took the delicate, hand-painted porcelain teacup that Linda had used, washed it carefully in the sink, and placed it back in the china cabinet behind the glass. I hired a local junk removal company to haul away the massive, sterile gray sectional sofa. When the room was finally clear, I walked into the corner, grabbed Eleanor's antique reading chair, and dragged it back to the exact center of the living room, resting it on the faded spot in the hardwood floor where she had sat every evening for 30 years. By the end of the week, the house didn't just look like mine again. It felt like Eleanor's again. I took the silver lock cylinder the locksmith had removed, and I placed it inside the dark green deed folder beside Eleanor's letter. It was no longer a piece of hardware. It was evidence. 2 months later, I was outside, kneeling in the dirt, pruning the dormant hydrangeas along the driveway, when an unfamiliar car pulled up to the curb. David got out. He was alone. He looked tired. The arrogant posture he had tried so hard to project during the family meeting was completely gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of a man who finally realized what he had broken. He walked up the driveway, stopping a few feet away from me. "Dad," David said quietly. "I didn't stop pruning. What do you want, David? I just..." I wanted to see how you were doing, and I wanted to apologize. I clipped a dead branch, the sharp snip echoing in the cold air. I stood up, brushing the dirt from the knees of my jeans, and looked at my only son. Why did you do it, David? I asked. The anger was gone now, replaced by a deep, hollow curiosity. Why did you stand on that porch and watch a stranger drill out the lock on your mother's house? David looked at the ground, shuffling his feet. I was desperate, Dad, he said, his voice cracking slightly. We lost everything. We were drowning, and when we moved in here, it was so big. You were so quiet. I thought it would be mine someday anyway. I thought we were just getting a head start on what was supposed to happen. I looked at him. I looked at the boy who still didn't understand the fundamental difference between receiving a gift and stealing one. That is exactly why it almost wasn't yours, I told him, softly. You thought my death was a financial transaction you could expedite. I didn't want to, David pleaded, looking up at me with tears in his eyes. I let Chloe push me. She kept saying it was the logical thing to do. She kept saying you'd be happier in a facility. I let her make the decisions. I shook my head. No, David, I corrected him. You didn't let her push you. You let yourself hide behind her. You didn't make a mistake, David. You made a plan, then let your wife speak it out loud so you could pretend it wasn't yours. David opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. He knew it was the truth. I can't fix this, can I? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I looked back at the house. The red front door stood out sharply against the gray winter sky. I don't know, David, I said honestly, but you can't fix it today, and you can't fix it by standing in my driveway making excuses. I turned back to the hydrangeas. Go home, David, I said, wherever that is now. He stood there for a long moment, hoping I would turn back around, hoping I would offer him the easy absolution I had always given him when he was a child. But I wasn't dealing with a child anymore. I was dealing with a man who had tried to lock me out of my own life. Eventually, I heard his footsteps retreat down the driveway. I heard the car door open, and I heard the engine start. I didn't look up as he drove away. Later that evening, I walked up the front steps of the house on Cedar Lane. The air was getting colder, promising snow before morning. I stood on the porch, looking at the solid oak door. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy brass key. I slid it into the cylinder. It went all the way in. I turned it to the right. The deadbolt slid back with a heavy, satisfying click. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and locked it securely behind me. My son thought inheritance was a door waiting to open. Eleanor knew better. Inheritance is not a key you steal from a living man's pocket. It is a trust you earn by remembering whose hands built the house before yours ever touched the lock. Would you forgive David if he blamed Chloe? Or did signing the locksmith invoice prove he stopped being just a weak son and became part of the theft? Let me know in the comments.